everyone's having a great night. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking today about understanding pediatric neuropsychological assessments through a growth and changing brain mindset. And so I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. David Supiennick. Did I pronounce it right? Did I get it?
So close, so close.
Okay. So he is a pediatric neuropsychologist specializing in working with children, teens, and young adults. He comes from a background with infant and child mental health and neuropsychological testing. So just seeing that broad background, I'm excited to be talking to him about this. Myself, I'm Casey Schmallicker, Assistant Director of New Frontiers. So I'm often on the receiving end of some of these neuropsychologicals. And I always, anytime I've spoken with neuropsychologists, but then also just specifically when I was first meeting David, there was just a resonance about how these often don't get used in the right way or viewed the right way. And so just based off that conversation, I wanted all of you guys to hear it. I really thought this is something that would benefit other professionals and benefit families. So first off, just before we dive in, I wanted to just launch a poll just so we could see the makeup of the audience in attendance. So if you could just complete that, we like to make sure we're speaking to where you guys are coming from. And just while you're filling that out, there is a questions dialog box for you to use. So I came up with, David, just some initial questions to get the conversation rolling, but please submit questions so that we can get to what you want to hear. We would much rather speak to what's on your mind than me trying to read your minds and guess it. And so any of your questions we'll get to. Yeah, okay, I'll close the poll. So just the makeup is 60% professionals. By the way, I always say this before. You're allowed to vote for 2 categories, so the percentages do not add up to 100. But 60% professionals, 20% parent of elementary school students, 20% parents of high school students, and 20% parent of other. Just for that parent of other, quick shout out. The way we're about to talk about these things, it's not just for kids. Any neuropsychological, it's just kids are, that's where a lot of focus often is of working on skills. So just to kind of dive right in, David, like what, and I know this wasn't a question we talked about before, but how do you sometimes see the consumers of a neuropsychological report sometimes using it in the wrong way? Like I know I've seen people gravitate towards certain things. So like, how have you seen some people use it inappropriately? And then that can lead us into the conversation of like some of the great ways to use these neuropsychologists.
Yeah, oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, first off, thank you for having me, and hello to everyone. How do people use it in the wrong way? You know, I think some of it is probably not utilizing the interventions, the recommendations that get made, and some of that I think kind of will relate to some of the questions that we had talked about in terms of how you should be using those recommendations and interventions. But yeah, I think oftentimes maybe not utilizing kind of going back to the neuropsychologist if there are things that you misunderstood, that a lot of times can lead to maybe not using the report in the correct way. And then I think also if you've got a child who's going to be working with some other provider based on the recommendation from those neuropsychological reports, then not kind of cluing in that other provider to what was found out from the evaluation. So not sharing aspects of that evaluation to whoever the provider is going to be, and then vice versa, you know, especially if you're going to continue to see the neuropsychologist, to then relay back what is happening in, you know, speech therapy, if that gets recommended, or some sort of executive function coaching, to then have that collaboration, that often can get missed by families as well.
And so something I often see is it's almost like sometimes these neuropsychologicals feel like one and done. Like I got it, I got the interventions in place, and that's kind of it. And I just wanted to highlight so much because I think this is such an underutilized thing where when I've spoken with some people, they don't really get what it means. And so if you could just elaborate a little bit more on like, how welcoming are neuropsychologists? And I know you can't speak to everyone, but like in your experience, like, do you ever feel like you're talking at people? And like, how can you encourage either other professionals encouraging families or families themselves to engage with this report and engage with the doctor more?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think that's a challenge of us as neuropsychologists to figure that out, of how do we make this more presentable and more able to be managed and understood. You know, certainly for a lot of evaluation reports, they're being written at a level that people who maybe have gone to a graduate school may understand, but specifically like a graduate school in social work or psychology. And so I think that's something I've definitely noticed as I've gotten into the field, and seen over the last probably decade of neuropsychologists in general really understanding and taking ownership of, okay, we make these more presentable and make these more manageable for the families that we work with, so that they can be utilized correctly, and that they're not just these 15-page reports that don't hold meaning to a child's life or to a family, and that they can then be used as something where we can track to see, okay, we know that this kid came in with, you know, these various symptoms, and let's say they get diagnosed with a learning disorder, and we're going to put in all these interventions, and we want to be able to see, are the interventions working, so that it doesn't just become this one and done, where these families are only seeing you once, and then we don't ever know, is this stuff actually working? And so I think there's a way to be able to change that.
And so that's a perfect segue. I had something else, but this just brings me. Can you just talk a little bit about how, so like interventions, they're meant to help. They're meant to create change. But can you just talk about how these neuropsychologicals, like, they're not, it's not like your genetics.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
if you could just elaborate how it's like a window in time, and just bringing that even a little bit forward, specifically for the pediatric case, why that's so important to know that this is a glimpse in time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I always try and do with the families that I work with at just the outset of the evaluation is to like check in with the families of what do they know about neuropsych testing, like what is their understanding of what this report is going to tell them. Do they think it's a genetic test where they're bringing their kid in, we're taking blood and we're sending it off to a lab? Do they even like understand what happens in these evaluations? So I think that's definitely a piece I encourage any family members seeking these out to really make sure that they're understanding what it is that they're going to be paying their money for. But then in terms of kind of it being a window into a particularly child's life, is that with kids, what we know from research is that a kid's brain is developing up until about the age of 25. So any sort of kind of learning or interventions that are being put in place is going to change the makeup of their brain functioning and how they think about things, understand the world, are able to solve problems, are able to manage their day-to-days. And so if you're seeing a kid, especially a kid really young, and you're starting to notice that there are some challenges that they're running into, while also having some strengths that you want to pick out, you can then help one, individualize what those interventions look like so that you can help build some skills to either kind of remediate those challenges or really kind of lessen those challenges, or accommodate them in some way, or teach the kids skills to be able to work around those areas that are more difficult for them, while also really enhancing their strengths. And then you want to be able to see, okay, we know at this time point when they were really little, maybe there was also something going on in the family, or also something happening in the environment that was really impacting the symptoms that they were presenting with. And 5 years later, maybe things have calmed down, maybe they're in a new school, maybe they've got a lot more friends. You can then have these kind of various time points to see, okay, now that we know all this different data, what does this do for the symptoms the kid's presenting with? And how can we then use that information to just individualize these interventions even more and help them out even to that next degree?
And so this is just something I always get asked, and so I like to throw it out there. How often do you recommend someone get an updated neuropsych? And just like, I know we talked a little bit about this, like, what does that mean, updated neuropsych? Because I think some people think very black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. And this definitely is one that I get as well. So, typically a neuropsych evaluation is going to be maybe this 2 to 3 day evaluation where the kid is spending sometime between like 6 to upwards of like 10 hours with me doing a bunch of different tests to look at all the skills that kind of go into, what makes them a successful student, let's say. If I'm going to be doing an update, I may not need to do all of those tests that are taking 6, 8, 10 hours. We may be looking specifically just at their academic skills, because that was the one area that was the biggest challenge for them in the first evaluation. So maybe I'm spending 2 to 3 hours with them, and it's a much shorter, abbreviated evaluation where we can really look at, okay, these were the areas that we had some questions about, or that we put in some interventions for, and now we want to check in on those. So that then leads into, okay, so now how often do we need to do this? And it'll depend a little bit on what is the diagnosis, what were the interventions that were being put in place. It will depend on what the kid's age is when we initially tested them. What grade were they maybe in? Do we want to also, sometimes the kids I'm working with, I might see them at the beginning of middle school and then may see them again kind of near the beginning of high school, where there are these kind of big changes in their environment that we then may want to kind of fine tune what some of those interventions are. So certainly kind of depends on a variety of factors, but I would say on average, I'm recommending somewhere between like 2 to 3 years for kind of the younger kids. I may not need to see an older kid that regularly. It may be more if, like, let's say we put in some interventions and we want to just kind of check a year later for like a short evaluation, we may do that. Or we may say, okay, look, you've got all these kind of tools for the next few years, unless something major kind of changes in your life and you've got some new concerns or the symptoms have worsened, we may not need to see you again, if at all.
It's always my favorite question when like in coaching, they're like, how long?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like everyone's different. Like everyone does have different things. another great thing to access your neuropsychologist and ask for advice on when do you recommend.
Absolutely.
So with this topic about like how they can be used for tools for growth mindset, like understanding a changing brain, I know that sometimes this testing can be perceived by the kid as like being like a lab rat, being poked and prodded, and there's something wrong because there's so much focus on what a neuropsychological diagnosis.
Yeah.
And I always joke diagnoses are they only benefit the insurance and the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
But how do you talk with people about these, and like how can you pass on some advice of how to stray away from, oh, we're going to see if you have ADHD, like that in and of itself is like a punishment, but
Sure.
how do you like to present to families and to individuals so that some of the people in the audience can start to reframe this, and then a little bit if you want to on why it's so important to reframe this?
Yeah, I think both really important questions, not only for the families, but also for the kids. I like to really think of it more as a discovery of really discovering how their brain works and discovering kind of fun, interesting aspects about their brain and helping them, the kids, really start to ask their own questions. And it can be things related to the things they're really good at, as well as the things that they know they're struggling with. You know, kids are very, very perceptive. They really just want to do well and be loved and you know, make the most out of life. And so when they are struggling, they tend to know that something is going on. They may not have the words to really describe what that something is. And a lot of times, you know, your families are finding these things out because a teacher mentions it to them, or you know, a family friend, or you know, it's something about how society is viewing this child. But kids can generally kind of pick up when something isn't going well for them. So whether that be, you know, they notice that they're slower at finishing tests than all the other kids in the classroom. They notice that their name is the one that gets called most often by the teacher. You know, they're going to pick up on those little things and be able to internalize those. And if they don't have the words to understand why they might be running into those challenges, they could possibly kind of come up with ideas on their own that aren't the most maybe positive or well-rounded. And so that then leads into like self-esteem issues and what kind of a misunderstanding of one's strengths and weaknesses can do to how they view themselves. So a lot of what I try and help parents do is find kid-friendly language to be able to discuss why it is they're coming to see me. So a lot of it ends up being kind of using their own words and asking them, hey, I noticed that you have had a hard time sitting and doing your homework. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And seeing what the kid kind of brings into it. Oh yeah, that always happened for me. Or, oh, I noticed that I'm always the last to turn in my assignments in the classroom. And kind of using that as then the end of, this is why we're going to be going to see, you know, a neuropsychologist. We're going to go see someone who can help us better understand why you're always the one who turns in your assignments last. They're also going to help us understand why you can finish a Rubik's Cube in 2 minutes. You know, you're also then kind of like pulling in some of the things that they do that are strengths, because that also is going to be a piece of what I, at least as a neuropsychologist, and I hope most neuropsychologists are doing, of balancing out, okay, these are some areas that are more challenging, but we also have some areas that are stronger. So I think that got a little off topic of what you were saying.
No, I have so many things to comment on there. Like that was really great because like I know what, like I go through executive functions when I'm doing like intakes, consultations.
Yeah.
And the one of the things that often gets the biggest aha is when I describe initiation as like a thing that people can struggle with.
Yeah.
And I can literally see, not literally, figuratively see the I'm stupids flying away of wait, that's like a thing?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I can't get started. It's not that I don't want to do homework, it's that I can't.
Yeah.
And then just now it's meaningful. And I think that's so important about how you were talking about use their language. Find something that's meaningful for them. And I just think it's so humanistic and like fits in with like self-determination.
Yeah,
it's not for everyone else to know about their brain. Now, I'm not saying you're going to make a full neuropsychological make sense to a 5-year-old.
Sure.
But make the attempt to get some of it to click. And I just wanted to highlight how much that just resonates when I hear that.
Yeah. Also, to your point, like with even words like initiation, with like a diagnosis too, it's like we use these clinical terms, like to what you said earlier, a lot of times often just has to do with insurance and what I as a provider kind of have to do from a medical model in terms of seeking reimbursement. But, you know, I think that's where that can become then a real a family decision in terms of like sharing a diagnosis with it. That sometimes I will have kind of more specific conversations with a family why we may or may not want to share a diagnosis. But oftentimes, right, kids want to be able to put language to the experiences that they're having. And with like initiation, that's a really great example of a lot of times the idea is I'm unmotivated, or what gets told to them is that they're lazy, when it really has nothing to do with you're wanting to do something. And so being able to kind of help families put language to the difficulties that they're presenting with, I think that's really the most important piece of it, whether you want to really label it. Some people find comfort in having a label and some people don't. So I think it's more about just putting the words to it.
And I love the other thing I just wanted to highlight, just because it's so important, is focusing on the strengths as well. And I'm not saying like strengths, like only do this with people with 140 IQ in a certain subtest. It could be relative strength. Like that's an important term to understand, is that all functioning people rely on their strengths to compensate their weaknesses. And so just one thing just that I know, like just an example for people as like a consumer of these, working with people, how with that growth mindset is, hey, your let's say your working memory isn't that high. And so that's a challenge, but you have great auditory processing. Like it really works, your auditory processing, you gather auditory information well. So when you're studying, when you just try to read off the paper, you're using your working memory. But if you say it out loud or you sing it, now you're leaning on that auditory processing, which is a strength of yours. And that's where it really ties into that growth mindset. don't dwell on the challenges so much. Acknowledge them and compensate with strength. So just really wanted to highlight. Now, we got a question from the audience. I'm not sure, and it's not me questioning your knowledge, but I'm not sure if you feel comfortable because it's about medication. So it's, and I know you're not a psychiatrist, so.
Sure.
But I'll ask it anyway, and if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to, but do you use genetic testing to help narrow down which medications are compatible with someone's genes, and how accurate is it?
So definitely outside of my knowledge range. I mean, there certainly are times where I may be utilizing genetic testing as a referral for my evaluations when there are real kind of medical concerns, but definitely outside of my wheelhouse of knowledge in terms of genetics and medication.
Yeah, definitely a psychiatrist. I'll work on getting a psychiatrist for a future one.
That can be the great.
Join us again, Michelle. So one thing that I just heard this the other day, and it's a little bit of a follow-up to like that window of time and the developing brain and the growing brain. And part of this might get a little ethical, like just on how you approach things, but like, can diagnoses change? So there's like, I'm not a medical professional, and I'll sometimes tell people like, kids grow out of things. Like when you go in too much at once, like they're 5 years old, like how much of I guess what I often hear a lot is how much of this is just being a teenager? How much of this is just this? And some people that get testing early, they feel like it's a life sentence. And so just like, again, it's a little bit of how we engage with diagnoses, but just I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. Are these things that they can grow out of? Like what, just, you get the gist of what I'm saying to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a few things that you touched on that I would want to highlight a little bit. So one, I think, is this idea of how much of these symptoms that I'm telling you about are just my kid being a kid or this being a teenager thing. So, you know, one, I think the point that you're getting to me as a neuropsychologist often says that whatever these symptoms are getting to a degree that it's impacting this kid's life in some sort of a negative way. Now, that doesn't mean I have not ever not diagnosed someone with something, that ultimately it just ends up being something that has to do maybe with like something in the environment. And if we can just change the environment, then like really you'll see the symptoms are going to go away. So not that that doesn't happen, but oftentimes, if you're getting to that point, there's usually something where the functioning in some way is being impacted. Like their grades are starting to drop. They're always getting into fights in school. Things in the household have gotten really bad. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the kid. If it's something in the home or in the environment, we have to also consider the other people in those environments as well, and not just place blame on a kid. So I think that's kind of one aspect of your question. Another aspect of your question is, are these diagnoses ever going to change? Could it possibly have been the wrong diagnosis? So I think that kind of leads to like just our understanding of neuropsychology and kind of how we understand how the way the brain works. So there certainly has been a big push in the last few years for this new term of neurodivergence, and really understanding that our brains are all unique. And while a lot of people's brains kind of fall in one area, there's a lot of people that have divergence or differences in the way that they think about things and view the world. And if we apply the same thing to every single person, that's not going to work for everybody. So you are going to run into people who have more challenges or who don't kind of fit perfectly into our society or the way something works within our society. So should a diagnosis necessarily change? No, I mean, you want to really hope that you, in doing this evaluation, you're really getting a good understanding of what is going on that's leading to these problems. But sometimes our understanding of what those diagnoses are will change over time. And so you'll see, especially if you're working with a kid who is going to be seen over a long period of time, that sometimes as us as neuropsychologists have changes in our kind of diagnostic labeling and understanding of things, that you went and got diagnosed with something at age 3, 4, 5, and now at age 15 it's being called something different, or it's changed in some way. And sometimes, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, the diagnoses can change, the criteria can change. It'll probably be a little while. They had a recent like major overhaul, so it'll probably be a little while, but that's not the point. The point is it's less so on the diagnosis and more on the symptoms. Like I often joke, there's like 300,000 combinations of symptoms that can lead to an ADHD diagnosis.
Right.
So I always say, which one are you?
Yeah.
And so how do you see that focus on, like, are we focusing on the wrong thing? Who cares if the diagnosis changes?
Right.
Like,
I mean,
as long as the interventions are working, right?
Yeah. I mean, that really was like the third piece of that question of, right, like the symptoms themselves are going to change. And so I think getting stuck in like, well, what do we call this isn't really where energy, in my opinion, should be invested. It really should be in just a fuller understanding of a child, of both their strengths and the areas where they struggle. But in terms of specifically with where they struggle, right, understanding kind of the symptoms and that those symptoms can change over time, or how they impact you can change over time. Take the example of ADHD. A lot of times, especially in males with ADHD, those hyperactive symptoms tend to be the ones you see the most. They're the kind of energizer bunny. They're running around the classroom. They're always getting into trouble, talking over you. And as they develop, those hyperactive symptoms may start to kind of dwindle a little bit, but you may see that they become more inattentive, that they have a harder time sitting and focusing for a long period of time, that they become forgetful about things. They start making careless mistakes. So you may see changes in that way with the symptoms that are being presented. Another example would be like if you've got someone with a learning disorder, that may impact them in one way in elementary and middle school, but then when you get to high school and college, where the type of, let's say it's a reading disorder, the type of reading that you're doing or how you take in that reading is going to change, that how those symptoms kind of present themselves or how those challenges present themselves will also differ as the kid ages.
And I feel like all of this, just to kind of like tie up that concept, you're not trying to cure a diagnosis.
Right.
And this is where it ties into this growth mindset. You're not trying to cure something, because that makes it sound like it's a magic fix or a magic pill often. This will make everything better. That's the antithesis of the growth mindset. Growth mindsets are about persistence and pushing through and trying new things. and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And so just like, I always tell people when they share with me a neuropsych, I'm like, do you know what these tests mean? Like, do you know what these numbers mean? Like, or did you just go to like, and some neuropsychological reports are great with the amount of verbiage to like really describe these, but I know it's also a lot for people. Like, so I'm like, what about the numbers? Like, and I'm a numbers guy, so I'm like looking at this, like, do you see why reading is hard for them? Just looking at these numbers, do you see it? Do you see why they struggle to sit down? And I think that's just so important, because now, you know what? Maybe the option of like it's forcing your kid to do homework in the dining room to make sure they get work done. Well, is there a lot of distractions here? Is there noise? Is this like all of this where we zoom in now? Now we can be targeted. And so this is something that often comes up, and I definitely have thoughts on this. And I know you brought this up about sharing diagnoses, but why I don't want to lead the question. Is it important to involve kids in some part of the process of these results? Like why do you recommend one way or the other of their involvement? Because I know I totally hear you in what you mentioned earlier about the diagnosis, because we all deal with them. Like, you hear an ASD diagnosis, you're going to zoom in and Google and look up all of this stuff, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But like, how do you see some of that involvement? So I guess just like going on a little bit more beyond just language that's meaningful to them, but how do you encourage people to involve their kids and in this piece of using that report afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really kind of stuck with me while you were speaking is just this idea of constant betterment that really kind of goes in with that growth mindset of just constantly striving to understand yourself better and grow your skills and build your strengths, and just constantly thinking more and more. That doing that by getting the kids buy-in is one really kind of make sure that you're setting them on this progression, and hopefully a positive progression. So I definitely think it's important to include the kids in the feedback, whether that be I myself doing a feedback with them, whether that be me helping to facilitate feedback with the parents, all do it together. You know, it can take a variety of forms, but I absolutely think it's important to be able to do that and to help make sure that the kids are understanding. One, you know, they just sat with me for like 8 to 10 hours, and they are probably going to be curious as to what all that actually meant. So helping them understand why we were sitting together for that long of a period of time. Again, kind of being able to give them language to then make sense of the challenges that they might be running into. Sorry, there's a
I have my fingers crossed that it wouldn't happen.
Really open. But so yeah, giving them the language as well. And I think to a point I made earlier of if we don't do it, then they're just going to fill in the blanks themselves, and oftentimes not with super positive things. And so you really want to make sure that you are including them in those conversations so that they can have an understanding of what's going on for them, and helping them feel empowered to advocate for themselves, because you know the hope is that as they continue to grow older, to what we were talking about a little bit before of like, are these things lifelong? A lot of these diagnoses are going to be these lifelong diagnoses. They don't just have a cure, but they may change in what they look like or how they impact a person in their day-to-day. And so we really want to make sure that the kids have that ability to advocate for themselves and to understand how these how their strengths and weaknesses are going to play into their day-to-day so that they can do that on their own eventually.
And there's just two things I wanted to comment there, and then if you had anything to add in. So first of all, we talked about how some of these neuropsychologicals are like windows into their brain at any given time. Guess who lives in that brain? Like, if you really want insight, all of this information came out of them from the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter how early, just to David's point from earlier, adding in language that they can use to describe these things so that they can be the quintessential partner moving forward to continue describing how they're thinking. Like, that's a lot of metacognition, being able to talk about that stuff. I just think it's so important. It's one of the things I always say to every individual that I work with. I do not know how your brain works. You're the only one that knows. And everything that I will learn about your brain is from me talking with you and asking you questions. And so it's never too young. And the one other point I just wanted to throw out, so we use a problem-solving acronym called RISE, of recognizing problems, identifying solutions, like, or strategies, strategy implementation, and then evaluating effectiveness. And I often try to explain to parents sometimes, but I explain this to professionals as well. If I told you to hop on one foot every single morning for 5 minutes, the first thing you're gonna do one of two things. You're gonna ask me why, or you're just not gonna do it. Like, that's what's gonna happen. And sometimes with these interventions and recommendations, we don't root them for the kid or the individual to understand why. This is to help with this challenge. And then we wonder why, like, they're resistant and they don't get it, and they feel like it's a punishment. And so I just think that's so important of making that connection before strategies. You have to root it in what is the problem or what is the challenge we're trying to overcome, because guess what? Not every intervention works for everyone. And so you need to have an evaluation on it if it's actually working, and you need their involvement. So if they don't know what it's trying to address, how can they say if it's helping? So I threw that out there because as I heard you talking, but I didn't know if there was anything about that that you wanted to comment on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also brings it back to your very first question of how these aren't being used in the right way. And I think that is kind of a way, and maybe that they aren't necessarily always being used in the right way when families don't and really involve the kids in them, or you know, I'm only getting a snapshot. You know, we talk about how this is really just a window. Like, I get just a small snapshot of what this kid is like in their kind of current life. And while yes, I may have like grade, you know, I might have like report cards or an evaluation from the past that also gives me a little bit of a hint of what might have come before, I'm really just getting a small slice of their entire lives. And the families are the ones who really know them the best, and themselves, like you said, like they're the ones having to live with what's going on in this window. And so wanting to make sure that they really are understanding what the interventions are, why they're being recommended, and to make sure that they really individualize them, and that if they aren't working, that they feel comfortable then coming back to me or talking to one of their other providers about, hey, this intervention doesn't feel like it's doing what it needs to be doing. And then we can have a discussion about why that might be, so that we can make sure that the kid is getting exactly what it is that they need to be getting.
So we just got a question. It's on a lot of the things that we've talked about, but I wanted to give the opportunity for you to readdress it. So this is a mother finding that her teen who understands ADHD giftedness LD is now reading too much on the internet and YouTube, and now is self-labeling himself with all the negatives that can come concurrently. So almost that self-fulfilling prophecy. So that comes with these diagnoses. Instead of looking for his strengths, he focuses on the negative, have trouble finding a professional to assist him since his issues are so multifactorial. So just before, I will say, there definitely is a component of teenager as well. Teenagers tend to focus on all of their challenges. But now, just to pass over to you, David, like, what would you give us some feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is first and foremost, this is a very teenager thing. And so, you know, one of the things that I sometimes have to work on families with is kind of managing their own expectations and understanding of how these various diagnoses, and especially when you've got these kind of multifaceted where there's you know, not only behavioral, but also academic and probably some social difficulties that are all coming together, that it can be very challenging to not just sit in those negatives. So I think some of it is being able to kind of recognize that, and possibly sometimes for my parents that I'm working with have worked through their own feelings about what that means for them. And then right now, how do we also support the kids so that they don't just focus on the things that aren't going well? So sometimes it is a lot of like finding and kind of catching them in those moments where they're doing positive things. You know, I think oftentimes, especially in a kid who it does sound like has these kind of multiple layers of challenges, it's easy to just catch them in the moments where they've done something wrong or where they're messing up. And so really being mindful of helping them recognize the moments where they are doing something well, because those often go overlooked, and we do it, I think, in our own lives. It's a lot easier to kind of remember and dwell on something that doesn't go right in our day, as opposed to all of the little things that do go right. And so I think that's a piece of it. And you know, I think some of it is probably finding the right providers, and every provider is going to be the right fit for somebody. I think especially in something like what I do, so much of what might go on in therapy session or an evaluation is about the relationship that I'm having with the person I'm working with. And I'm not going to be a perfect fit for everybody, and that's okay. And so it's about finding the person that is, so that whoever's receiving the intervention can be fully open to it, and can really get the benefits out of it.
And what I will say, learning differences, which is just the blanket term I like to use. I don't like to get into like learning disabilities, all of this stuff. We all have different brains.
Absolutely.
So with this kind of learning differences, the other thing is a lot of them can be black and white thinkers. The gray area can be difficult. So just to go back to the base of this report and to your question, whip out that neuropsychological. He's going on YouTube and looking at what every ADHD struggles with. Well, let's go back to the neuropsych and see what you struggle with, not everyone else. What are your struggles? And then that's a perfect way to segue to what are your strengths that are also in this report. And it's very concrete, like you can't debate it. When you're on YouTube, there's so much obfuscation and just debating these things of, no, don't you see this fits in? Well, no, it doesn't. It's not your brain. Now, maybe you're not using some strategies, but just to back up what David said, it's also so important for you to help provide that positive feedback, because a lot of what happens with kids is they want, and I think David said this earlier, they want you to be proud of them. And maybe there's shame about these challenges. And so hearing from you as a parent could really help bolster up some of that confidence. The flip end, teenagers might say, you're just trying to make me feel good. And I will give it out to parents. You can never win with your kids. Like, you could do everything right, and it's just how they perceive things. So that is another aspect where sometimes to help someone have a growth mindset, parents can't be everything. COVID did put a lot of pressure on parents to be everything. Be the parent, be the friend, because they couldn't be social, be the, like, you had to be everything. And one of those things was this kind of coach, mentor, educator role. And there are certain times and certain kids where you just might not be the best messenger. As much as you want to be. It could be a teacher in school. I know I was in behind classes, whatever, remedial classes, finally got fast tracked, and I had an 8th grade math teacher that was like, I will be here at 7 a.m. every single morning before school. You can come whenever you want. I see potential in you. That's all I needed for everything to kind of click into place. Some mentor to break through. So, and as a parent, just my advice is stick through it. Like, you've got to be that motivator. You've got to try and be strong and not react too much.
I mean, I think for the parents I work with as well, it's about helping them find their own support system. And oftentimes I'm always learning something new, especially when I'm doing a reevaluation where, you know, I learn about some new support group or not some new parent group. And that's where sometimes having those labels and those diagnoses can help, or at least kind of help families come together to find people who have some commonalities to the experiences that they're going through. But absolutely, for these families, is some of that perseverance that's the most challenging.
All right, so we think we're going to wrap up there. I gave a couple of last minute calls for questions. I'll fill in for another like 30 seconds to see if there's any other last minute ones. No one saw me going to the chat. But so really just, we're going to have a follow-up survey that gets sent around. There's some feedback questions in there, but if you have a question specific for David, I'll be sure to get those over. We get a fancy little report that I get set up. So if there's any specifics, you can just put it into that follow-up survey, and we'll get back to you and try to present some direction. In terms of kind of taking this, we're going to be posting, we'll email around a recording for everyone that was in attendance. Anyone that jumped in late, I saw some, so I'll be emailing one out. I just got to make it a little pretty first, so I might need a couple of days just to edit. But then I'll get that out. And anyone that you think might benefit from this, please share them the link when I share it over with you. So I think I bought enough time there to give people a chance for questions, and I didn't see any. So David, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I always get anxious when I see on my day that it's going to be a 12-hour day, and I always forget how much I enjoy these conversations.
Right.
It's just, they're inspiring to kind of like why we do this work, and I feel like it's also important for just people to hear these positive aspects. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to more.
Yes, thank you so much.
Have a great night, everyone. Bye-bye.